Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we are going to start learning about verbs of motion. Verbs of motion are a special class in Russian and other Slavic languages, and they do not behave like verbs of motion in English or most other Western European languages. So just go into this with a certain amount of humility, possibly even bordering on fear. I don't want to freak you out too much, but be aware that this is one of the more challenging aspects of learning Russian. That being said, we will start off with it slowly, and you will get lots of guidelines for how to use Russian verbs of motion correctly. Let's start with the basics. And the basics is that Russian has no word that just means to go. There is no equivalent in Russian of the English word to go. Instead, in Russian, you always have to distinguish between unidirectional and multidirectional motion and motion on foot versus motion by vehicle. So they have kind of 4 different words that mean to go, whereas in English we have 1. On slide 3 here, we have a chart of the 4 main verbs of motion. So these are all kind of the Russian equivalent of to go. And you can see here they are divided between motion on foot versus motion by vehicle and unidirectional versus multidirectional motion. So unidirectional motion is just when you're going towards a specific goal in one direction. Multidirectional motion is when you are making a round trip or moving in circles, or have some kind of aimless, not goal-oriented motion. And you will learn much more about this later, but just remember that these are the 4 main divisions. And so you can see here that for motion on foot, we have both a unidirectional version, идти, and a multidirectional version, ходить. And I have the conjugations of all of the verbs here along with their infinitives. And we've already learned идти, so иду, идешь, идет, идем, идете, идут, and then шел, шла, шло, шли for the past. Ходить, this multidirectional foot motion verb, is a second conjugation verb with a shifting stress, and it also has a consonant mutation in the я form. So we have ходить, the infinitive, я хожу, ты ходишь, он ходит, мы ходим, вы ходите, они ходят. And then the past is completely regular and expected. Он ходил, она ходила, оно ходило, они ходили. And then at the bottom here, we have our vehicular motion verbs. And again, we have both the unidirectional form ехать and the multidirectional form ездить. Pay attention to the conjugation for both of these in the non-past. Ехать has this pretty freaky thing going on here, where when we conjugate it, the stem suddenly drops its ch and turns into de. So я еду, ты едешь, она едет, мы едем, вы едете, они едут. And then in the past, it's completely regular. Он ехал, она ехала, оно ехало, они ехали. Ездить is also a second conjugation verb with a consonant mutation in the я form, but it has a fixed stem stress. So я езжу, notice that the d becomes a ж in both ходить and ездить in the я form. Я езжу, ты ездишь. Он ездит, мы ездим, вы ездите, они ездят. And then он ездил, она ездила, оно ездило, они ездили. Now let's go over some basic guidelines for using these verbs of motion. And let's start with some guidelines for when to use the foot verbs, идти and ходить, versus the vehicular verbs, ехать, ездить. So you generally want to use the foot verbs, идти or ходить, when you are specifying motion on foot or it is obvious that you are walking. For example, я иду в библиотеку, and you are obviously walking. Someone sees you walking across campus and says, hey, where are you going? And you say, I'm going to the library, and you're obviously walking. You're going to use идти. Я иду в библиотеку. When you are indicating travel around town or campus or some enclosed place like that, and there is no vehicle specified. So in Russia, when you travel around town, you are normally going to go on foot or by public transport, and so people normally use the foot verbs. For example, я часто хожу в библиотеку. I often go to the library. The library is in town, or in your case, on campus. And because you're not talking about a specific vehicle, it's just assumed that you'll be going on foot, and you use the foot verbs. And then when you are describing the motion of the actual forms of transport, they frequently take the foot verbs. Because these foot verbs, they're not actually foot verbs, they're more sort of like self-propelled verbs. They describe self-propelled motion. So the bus, автобус, propels itself, it powers itself. And so автобус идет, the bus goes. А я еду на автобусе, and I go by bus, or I'm riding on the bus. And so the actual forms of transport will often take идти ходить, but when you are riding on the transport, you will use ехать ездить. And so when do we use the vehicular verbs? Obviously, when you have some form of transport specified, or when someone sees you and you are obviously riding on a form of transport. For example, я еду на автобусе. I'm taking the bus, or I'm riding the bus. Or when you are talking about travel to another city, state, or country, obviously you're going to use a vehicle to get there, and so you use a vehicular verb. You use a verb of riding. For example, я еду в Москву. I'm going to Moscow. You are not in Moscow now. You're going to have to travel a long distance to go to Moscow. Obviously, you're going to take a vehicle, and so you say я еду в Москву. Now let's talk about some guidelines for using verbs of motion and distinguishing between when to use unidirectional verbs versus multidirectional verbs. So you want to use the unidirectional verbs, идти or ехать, when you are indicating motion currently in progress. For example, someone could ask you, куда ты идешь? Where are you going? And you could answer, я иду в библиотеку. I'm going to the library. You have motion in one direction that is currently in progress. You will also use these unidirectional verbs to indicate repeated actions or repeated one-way trips. And this is normally going to be if you have a specific trip that you take at the same time, where that specific unidirectional leg is taken at the same time. For example, каждый день в 9 часов я иду в библиотеку. Every day at 9 o'clock, I go to the library. And then you go all kinds of other places, and overall, you have multidirectional motion. But at 9 o'clock every day, your motion is unidirectional. You are making a one-way trip, and so you use a unidirectional verb of motion. Conversely, you're going to want to use a multidirectional verb of motion, so ходить or ездить, when you indicate repeated round trips. So you have both the trip there and the trip back. For example, каждый день я хожу на занятия. Every day I go to my classes. Every day I go to class. And there you are indicating both the motion to class and the motion from class. And so you have round trips. You are also going to use a multidirectional verb of motion when you are indicating a single round trip in the past. For example, вчера я ходила в библиотеку. Yesterday, I went to the library and I came back. We have multidirectional motion because there is a round trip, so we are going to use ходить even though it was only one time. And so there you have your overview or your introduction to verbs of motion. If it seems easy and straightforward, fantastic. Don't get cocky. It's probably not nearly as straightforward as you think it is, but I'm happy for you right now. If it seems really overwhelming, take a deep breath, maybe go over this a couple of times, and remember that we will go over this a bunch of times in class. And as always, the best thing is to expose yourself to as much Russian as possible to see how these constructions are used in their native habitat.